There's a lot of exciting stuff coming in Update 35 for the Lord of the Rings Online, and today we have the first round of beta notes for the update. Already knew about the Warden Revamp, Captain Revamp, and Power Revamp, but we'll also be going over some other gameplay and system changes, as well as anything else exciting. Now, because there is so much in this beta, which is expected to start sometime today when this video is uploaded, this video will just be an overview, but I will also be streaming this update and checking everything out live here on YouTube later this evening. So do tune into that if you're interested in actually seeing all this stuff. There are so many major general changes coming to the game that I actually forgot to mention that this update will include a new instance cluster, which includes 2 small fellowship instances, a fellowship 6-man instance, and a 12-man raid. These are going to be a more modern instance in Carn Dum, which is in Angmar, but this is going to be more modern as in where LOTRO is in Lord of the Rings timeline after the events of Gundabad. At least I think that's how it will work. Anyway, what we see here is a whole bunch of class changes that we will be diving into more detail later. And I think we should first look at the mastery changes coming to the game. So this is going to change how mastery influences your total damage output and that calculation. So before we dive too much into the details, I find it really interesting that Standing Stone Games has shared a lot in their roadmap for 2023 and just general previews of what we would be getting, but they still find room for surprises, and this is something that they have been working on in the background for the past few months, changing how mastery and damage work to hopefully be better for the future. While things will indeed be different than they were before, I think this will ultimately be better for the game based on what we have in the beta notes here. So I'm going to just focus on the new version of how mastery works in the calculation now. And what we see is that mastery is going to be its own multiplier in the calculation for damage. And the additive damage modifiers are going to be separate, and then any multiplier modifiers, which will now be explicitly indicated in skill and trait tooltips, it sounds like, will also be treated normally, as in still multipliers. So what really is going to matter for you as a player is that a lot of the effects that modify damage in one way or another should now work more as you would probably expect. And this is especially true if you have a large combination of different modifiers going on. Now with this, they are going to have to do some rebalancing of a lot of damage modifiers in the game, whether that be from traits or traceries. There's basically anything that can modify your damage will be adjusted. So the full list, of course, is going to be in the patch notes if you want to read through it. Although as somebody who does play the Runekeeper a decent bit, I find it kind of funny that they have no changes. Also, as somebody who hasn't touched PvMP in quite a few years, I'm really confused with the Shaman section. Perhaps that means Defiler, but honestly, if there was a Shaman in the game, I might just play that. So that sounds all good from a damage perspective, but now we have to talk about power. So I'm going to keep an open mind as we dive into this, but I am still skeptical about any sort of power change where it's going to become a resource that you have to manage being good. Before I even read any of this, I will say that I think one of the big concerns I have with a power change is you just sitting there in combat with nothing to do while actually sitting there waiting for power to regenerate and maybe just auto-attacking at most. To me, that is basically the opposite of fun gameplay and would be a huge step back for gameplay in LOTRO. So with that in mind, let's dive into this. And this is something that is true, and I'm hoping they're actually planning on addressing, because a lot of skills are going to be limited by cooldowns rather than power. So maybe these big heals that they're talking about right here could actually be limited by power instead of cooldowns. That doesn't inherently sound bad as long as they address the cooldowns issue, but let's continue. So ultimately, we're going to have a larger power pool, especially after level 100, I think is when it stops scaling, somewhere around there. But the whole point is by level 140, you should have roughly 50,000 or more power. And the power cost of skills will continue to scale up as you level as well. We're also getting a rework to the Fate stat, and that it will no longer increase your in-combat power regen like it will before this update comes out, and instead it will increase your total amount of power and auto-combat power regen. So to gain increased in-combat power regen, you will need specific items, it sounds like, or it just naturally increases with level, hopefully by a meaningful amount that makes sense with the scaling that they have now. So as far as regeneration, which I think is very important, first of all, that will be listed as per second, which I agree makes much more sense, but Also, in less than a minute, you should be able to fill your power bar with doing nothing. Now, that's still a very long time in terms of gameplay, but lower cost skills will actually break even or cost less than your regeneration rate of power, so you can gain power with some low cost skills. Again, this was one of my big concerns, is actually getting completely stuck without power for a long time, and again, just sitting there waiting with nothing to do because you need power. So the way this power revamp will work is it should only apply to longer combat. This can be longer combat in any form, but typically you run into longer fights in group content, of course. So it looks like every class will have some sort of long cooldown emergency button to restore a lot of their power, which I think is going to be beneficial. And I think this is actually one of the bigger points, that each class will have a low-end skill or effect that can be used as part of a general rotation to generate additional power on the fly. So a power generation skill that would basically solve the concerns I have, as long as you do have that frequently available, so you aren't sitting there just waiting for power to regen. You actually have an ability that taps into this resource and generates it in this case. So they do have a couple examples here, but it will probably take actually playing these classes and seeing what it's like in beta when that comes up to get a better idea of how this will work. So in general, tanks should have the least concern with power issues, and I think that is a good thing, because tanks need to have power available to do all the stuff they need to do in group content, and healers will probably have the biggest concerns with power and managing that resource as you heal your allies. So this actually leads into the healing changes that are coming in this update, and in particular for level 131 to 140, so really high level endgame characters, basically, healing will be increased. They're also going to be changing, it looks like, how Lore Master works with power, at least a little bit. Because as we know, that was one aspect of the Lore Master that is perhaps less important than it used to be, their power healing. The other class that I want to highlight here is going to be the Hunter, which is going to have a rework for a number of their traits, especially dealing with power. And as I say, all the existing power mechanics were crowded into the blue tree. And I actually, on my leveling hunters, run out of power very frequently in the blue line without any stats, or at least being high level. It starts to not really matter. But the whole point is that they are going to be doing some changes to the Hunter and even make them work how I remember them working in the old days. Not that I played Hunter all that much, but I do remember Burn Hot increasing power costs, and you actually burnt out of power while you were in Burn Hot. So that's something that's you're going to have to pay attention to with the Hunter in probably all classes. I also find this line funny, that they haven't gotten much feedback yet on how their power is playing out for the Guardians. I don't know if that means any alpha testers. For people that don't know, alpha is completely private in LOTRO, and besides leaks that we occasionally get, the testers actually have to sign like NDAs and that sort of stuff to not share anything. So all the other testers besides alpha would probably be internal, and I guess they just haven't gotten to playing the Guardian yet and giving feedback. Anyway, I just thought that was notable, and you know what? This also deserves a note. Baronings still don't have power. They have Wrath. They don't have to worry about power. I think the current form of Wrath really does not work well, especially for Redline, but we can ignore that for now and move on. I will say overall I am less concerned with power after reading that, but now let's get into some of the class revamps and start here with Warden. So I already did a video that detailed a lot of the Warden changes from the post that we got from the developer, but now we actually have the full list of beta changes. So it seems like early on here we actually have one of the answers to my questions about spear sweeping, and that seems to have perhaps gone away. So Cauterizing Steel, which will be a new gambit at the end of the boot, so the 1-2 line, that will deal, strong damage to a single target, but it will also consume any physical bleeds from the power attack through Unerring Strike, that's the 1-2-3 gambit line. So it will consume those to deal bonus damage. Now, as far as these bleeding gambits go, it sounds like they will be mostly similar. They won't have a chain effect anymore. In fact, gambit chains are being completely reworked. If you have not seen that, I recommend checking out my Warden video deep diving into that. But these will deal strong bleeds that have a longer duration than other damage over time effects. It also looks like Android Maneuver and Warden's Triumph, two of the utility gambits that Wardens had, will remain mostly similar. I actually miss the days of using those two gambits a little bit more regularly. For Celebration of Skill, we have that Gambit has actually lost its buffs, which actually used to be helpful, especially with the incoming healing buff, but now it will give you some instant morale. Ready Blade, yet it says shield up here, so I don't know what's going on there, but that gives you a boring parry rating buff, but more excitingly, it gives you decreased incoming melee damage. And now Shield Tactics is going to be the crit defense and tactical mitigation rating, and temporary stun immunity. Now, while the Gambit itself will have a 1 second cooldown, which just matches other Gambits, the stun immunity effect will still have, I believe it's a 10-second cooldown, but I could be off on that. It will still have that cooldown effect, which is a bit unfortunate to see that little bit of inconsistency there, but I can honestly see why that's there for balance reasons. It's just kind of bothersome. But anyway, moving on, we have Fist Gambits, and wow, Goad lost its damage over time effect. I'm actually surprised to see that. Anyway, we have more information here on the new Spirit of Fate Gambit, which will finish out the Precise Blow or the 1-3 Gambit line, and that applies a short duration, strong damage over time effect. It's light damage to the target. It sounds like it's going to pulse relatively weakly, but also very frequently, so it will have overall more damage than other Gambits in the line. There's also going to be the new Deflection Gambit, and that almost sounds familiar somehow, but that reduces your threat level to enemies. And now Resounding Challenge. I really hope they did not butcher this ability. So, okay, it has adopted the effect that it has an assailment. So that is the one where it does damage over time. So now it will deal AoE damage and apply a dot to enemies hit. So when you're in Determination, it will also increase your threat over time, which I believe is what it used to do like way back in the day, if I remember correctly. Didn't there also used to be a Gambit that the only use of it was increasing your threat? Or was that Resounding Challenge? I honestly don't remember at this point. But we also have some information on the skills that you get, and it looks like the skills that they had in the initial Warden Rework thread were only for blue line tanking, and we do have stuff for red line, so let's dive into that. So it looks like Recklessness itself will be an advanced technique ability now that gives you a buff for increased initial skill damage, and then there's also going to be the Way of the Spear as another advanced technique ability that gives you a buff based on the last Gambit that you used. So the Spear one will be just increased initial Gambit damage, Shield one will be increased Gambit healing, that's even for a red line Warden. It sounds like you can be adaptive and have some flexibility to increase your healing, and then the Fist is good old damage over time. And we also have information on rapid techniques. I think this is what's supposed to not like fully replace Seize the Moment, but is something we get for losing Seize the Moment as a way to think about it. And this is going to be a self buff that gives your mastery 0 cooldown for 6 seconds. So it actually does give them completely 0 cooldown for 6 seconds, but after that it resets your mastery cooldown every 2 seconds for 6 seconds. So yes, it says a short burst with no cooldown, then a periodic reset, and that ability will be a cooldown on 90-second cooldown. It sounds exciting and more consistent than Seize the Moment because you can activate it yourself, but a 90-second cooldown on that also sounds like a long time. But hopefully that will still feel good with gameplay. We will see the removal of Shield Piercer, Wages of Fear, Dodge This, and most importantly, the absolute worst ability in the entirety of the game, Critical Strike, is gone. Honestly, I still really liked my idea of actually making that useful in an advanced technique, but seeing it gone is better than it being there, and yeah, that's just still better. I also find it funny that Critical Strike is lumped in with Javelin skills. I guess nobody used it, they didn't even know it wasn't a Javelin ability. Anyway, let's move to the blue line. Okay, there's actually a lot here in the trait changes, and it's probably more interesting actually seeing this in game, so we'll save that for later. Again, stay tuned for the stream later. And let's get moving on to the captain changes. So actually, like the Warden, I will wait to go over the trait changes until we can actually see them in game, because let's be honest, there are a lot, with all the classes even, with all the specs even. All right, so for the blue line, Defensive Strike is going to be a new, I guess, returning ability. I honestly don't remember that, but it's going to put you in a battle ready state, and for blue line, it will have a 10-second cooldown that's somewhat moderate, and it's a melee ability. So it sounds like it's ultimately going to work how Valiant Strike works right now for battle state maintenance purposes, maybe not the healing effects. I also will point out Gallant Display is one of my favorite abilities in the game, mainly just because of its animation and flavor, and it sounds like that will be having a little bit of a rework in this update, and its effect will depend on the spec that you are in, but overall Gallant Display will now tier up and actually have a much greater effect as you tier it up, but also cost a lot more power. Hey, that works in with the power revamp that they are doing. I still hope that power isn't too much of a concern overall with that ability just because it is so fun. But for the blue line, it will still be a moderate fellowship wide heal when it does hit a target. Moving on to the red line, they actually get Gallant Display as a base ability. I think I forgot to mention that, but yes, every line captain will get this awesome ability. And for the red line, it will just deal AoE damage, and as you use it more, it will deal more damage and cost more power. So Standalone is going to be the name of the new stance where you can shift basically from a group supporting captain to a more solo oriented captain. That the stance will give you a direct personal benefit to really your damage is what ultimately matters. So this will actually change a few of your abilities' names. So like Inspire will become Self-Determination, basically inspiring yourself. So that should help you out in solo gameplay and overall make solo gameplay a lot faster on the captain, I would certainly hope. I also don't see anything about defensive strikes, so I thought that was supposed to come to every trait tree, but either way, let's look at the yellow line version of defensive strike, and that just gives you a decreased incoming damage buff. I believe it's also supposed to activate the battle ready buff in yellow line as well. Hammer Stroke, that actually sounds really fun. This is a melee skill that deals, wait, this is yellow line only, but deals significant damage. Oh, gives you 30% parry chance buff for 15 seconds with a 45-second cooldown. I was going to say, that sounded just like the Guardian's Hammer Down ability, but especially with the significant damage, but it's for yellow line captain. It has a long cooldown. I wouldn't mind seeing that on every spec. It might be too much of a copy of Hammer Down though, if it is. Anyway, Frontline Resilience. I honestly don't remember this, so perhaps this is a new buff, but it negates 50% incoming damage for 10 seconds. And has a 4-minute cooldown and can be reduced by, I forget the exemplar effect, but I have heard that, as well as Call to Greatness. Oh, and here we are actually with the general skills. So with Defensive Strike, that is going to, has a 15-second cooldown at baseline. I think for blue line that was shortened, but it also will be in the red line. It sounds like replacing the effect of Shadow's Lament. And it's just another ability to give you the battle ready buff. This is the problem. Without actually seeing this stuff in game, I really forget the name of a lot of abilities or traits or effects for these classes that are not like ones I play very frequently. And it's been a while since I've really dived into the captain, because from my perspective, they really felt like they needed a rework. So that's why this is great to see, even if I'm not immediately remembering the names and effects of a lot of things. So a lot of abilities will have different effects based on your specialization, which makes sense. And I think that's another thing that we can dive into later. I have been sitting here recording a long time, but this really was supposed to just be an overview video. And you might remember at the beginning of this video, I actually mentioned that we would get back to this main page after taking a dive into all the extra pages here with the more specific details on specific changes coming in the beta. We do see with the power revamp a lot of the changes for Hunter here, if you're interested in more details on that, as well as some of the changes for Lore Master. I also did notice that Runekeeper, one of the classes that I've been talking about a bit lately because of my lack of playing before the Shadow, I noticed that they have had some decent sized changes that were unexpected. So basically, Fire, Lightning, Frost, aka all of your skill damage has been increased by 10%, it looks like. Epic Conclusion has also been made stronger, so maybe it's actually going to be stronger than Vivid Imagery now, which had slightly reduced damage. There's also going to be a couple changes that I, again, just wasn't really expecting to actually look into this stuff, but Scribe Spark will give you 2 attunement instead of 1, and Ceaseless Argument's going to have a much shorter cooldown at 0.3 seconds now, and it's going to have a quicker animation. It also looks like the AoE size of Static Surge has been increased to match the visual effects of it. Oh wow, Vivid Imagery, they have notes here about Vivid Imagery, but randomly down here, a perhaps even bigger one, is that it actually returns you to neutral attunement, which I think is a decently significant change for that. Oh, and this is also interesting with Frost skills being now spending attunement, so they move you towards neutral. That is one that kind of makes sense to me as well, because they're more utility abilities, and that matches what utility abilities are for the Runekeeper. Anyway, moving on, we do have some information for Delvings that they have been added to school and library at the Emirdine. So once you're in those instances, you can pick up the Delving, and then at the current moment in the beta, you will have to turn them in, I believe, in Cardalin and Swanfleet, but I think eventually that sounds like it could change. I'm ultimately excited to test that out, not just because we have Delvings for like larger size group content, but also because I think School and Library are a great fit for something like Delvings because they only have one tier of difficulty already, and it makes sense that instances only have one difficulty system in place. Alright, there are a lot of general changes here that I could recommend you read through if you want to, but one thing I have noticed just skimming through these is it sounds like the Brawlers are closer to becoming a full class in the game finally, with a lot of quests and just various reward systems actually giving Brawlers rewards now. Meanwhile, I'm still here just waiting for the Beorning to be a complete class. And before we get too much into that, let's go ahead and wrap up this video, and I hope y'all enjoyed the overview and my preview at least of what we are getting in the beta. Again, there's a whole lot here, and this was not meant to be inclusive of everything in the beta. We'll actually wait a little bit for that until we get to play around with it in the beta, but I'm honestly probably going to have a ton of content from all the stuff that we have in this. It's been a bit surprising with all we're getting here, in addition again to the new instance cluster. As usual, let me know what you all think of what you saw here, and if you enjoyed this video or learned something useful, please consider liking and subscribing for more, and thanks for watching everyone.